Putin wanted an empire. Instead, he's presiding over a slow-motion collapse. His invasion of Ukraine was supposed to be the first chapter in the restoration of Soviet glory, a show of strength to the world. But it's ended up exposing just how weak, brittle, and hollow Russia's foundations really are. Now, the country's fracturing from the inside out. Separatist movements are gaining momentum. The economy is suffocating under sanctions. Entire regions are slipping beyond Moscow's control, and Putin's fantasy of a new Russian empire is rotting in real time, right in front of him. He didn't just fail to rebuild the Soviet Union, he may have destroyed the Russian Federation instead, and the signs were there from the beginning. In fact, we can go all the way back to 1999, when the Russian president was only just emerging on the political scene for the first glimpses of his long-term ambitions. He'd only just been selected as the next Russian Prime Minister, and in one of his first speeches to the State Duma, one of the two chambers of the Russian parliament, he said, "Russia has been a great power for centuries, and remains so. It has always had, and still has legitimate zones of interest. We should not drop our guard in this respect, neither should we allow our opinion to be ignored." Through those words, Putin announced to Russia and the wider world exactly what sort of leader he was destined to be. And he's gone on to prove it through his actions, which have consistently demonstrated that he's a man who in many ways longs to live in the past, desperate to return to a time when Russia was the fiercest and most formidable entity on Earth. It's something he's spoken about over and over, perhaps most famously in 2005, once he had progressed to the position of president. In his annual address to the Federal Assembly of the Russian Union, he stated, "Above all, we should acknowledge that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a major geopolitical disaster of the century. As for the Russian nation, it became a genuine drama. Tens of millions of our co-citizens and compatriots found themselves outside Russian territory. Moreover, the epidemic of disintegration infected Russia itself." This statement has been brought up again and again over the years, and understandably so, as it so succinctly captures two of Putin's deepest and most sincere sentiments. First, it demonstrates his clear regret and remorse at the loss of Russia's former status. Putin was someone who grew up during the heyday of the Soviet Union. He even played an active role in building and cementing the Union's fearsome reputation around the world, spending 16 years working as a foreign intelligence officer for the Committee for State Security, more commonly known as the KGB, rising up the ranks to reach the position of lieutenant colonel before deciding to resign and pursue a career in politics. He witnessed the power of the Soviet Union firsthand, as well as the chaos that unfolded after it all fell apart in 1991. He watched on as his country's standing and status declined, and he vowed to do whatever he could to bring it all back. The statement also demonstrates exactly how Putin regards the millions of people living in former Soviet republics. He described them as co-citizens and compatriots. On the one hand, these could be seen as terms of endearment, or a specific reference to the many Russian-born people who found themselves suddenly living in other newly formed independent nations when the Union dissolved. On the other hand, it can also be seen as a sign of how Putin sees all former Soviet citizens as being part of the same family, with Russia as its head. The president has made similar remarks on numerous occasions since then. In 2021, for example, mere months before the war in Ukraine began, in comments aired as part of a documentary film entitled Russia, New History, Putin said, "It was a disintegration of historical Russia under the name of the Soviet Union. We turned into a completely different country, and what had been built up over 1,000 years was largely lost." He went on to call the incident a major humanitarian tragedy, expressing alleged sympathy for the estimated 25 million Russians who were cut off from their homeland as the Union ended and new borders were established. He also admitted to having to moonlight as a taxi driver just to make ends meet, demonstrating how the Union's collapse affected him on a personal level, while adding even more fuel to his burning desire to see the Russian Empire reborn. And it's not just in his words that the Russian leader has demonstrated this desire, but in his actions as well. Throughout his time in power, Putin has done all he can to maintain strong levels of political influence and control in as many former Soviet republics as possible, with varying levels of success. In Belarus, for example, Putin knows he can count on his puppet president, Alexander Lukashenko, to essentially do whatever he wants. In several Central Asian nations too, like Kazakhstan, the Kremlin's reach is clear to see. Putin has made the most of his country's superior size, wealth and resources to effectively ensure that countries like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan and Armenia have consistently relied on Russia for trade, security and survival. Over time, however, some of the former Soviet republics have slowly but surely slipped out of Moscow's grasp. Georgia is one of them, and has shown increasing interest in becoming part of alliances like the European Union or NATO, which is one of the reasons why Putin took action against it in 2008, initiating the short-lived Russo-Georgia War. Moldova is another. Like Georgia, it's shown active interest in joining the EU and building closer bonds with Europe while breaking free of Russian control. In response, Moscow has reportedly been attempting to meddle in Moldovan elections for many years, deploying its own Kremlin-backed candidates and even orchestrating protests and online misinformation campaigns in an attempt to sow seeds of chaos in the small Eastern European country. Then there's Ukraine. Regularly referred to as Little Russia by Putin and other Russian officials and elites, Ukraine has long been seen as perhaps the most important piece of the puzzle in Putin's plans to restore Russia's former glory. In 2014, he put the first phase of those plans into action, ordering his forces to seize control of the Crimean Peninsula. In 2022, he went much further, greenlighting the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The president has claimed that all of Ukraine is ours and asserted the Russian and Ukrainian peoples to be one people. In doing so, he's made his position abundantly clear. Putin's invasion was never just about the Donbass, nor was it about liberating Russian and Ukrainian people from some mythical made-up fascist regime. It was always about power, conquest, and attempting to bring back the golden era of the Soviet Union, expand Moscow's sphere of influence, and keep Russia's little brother out of the hands of the Western world. But it hasn't worked, and it never will. That's according to geopolitical analyst Manlio Graziano, former professor of geopolitics at Sciences Po and the Sorbonne in Paris, France. Graziano recently sat down for an interview with the Kyiv Post to express his views on Putin's hopes, ambitions, and failures in Ukraine. He was asked about the idea that Russia had some sort of geopolitical right to dominate Ukraine based on historical and cultural ties, responding, "Historically and politically, such arguments have no real basis. Actually, the Russians are not claiming rights over Ukraine, they're claiming the right to rebuild the Russian Empire." Graziano continued, "When Putin said in 2005 that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, he made his intentions clear. But even earlier, when Yeltsin and the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus dissolved the USSR in December 1991, they immediately created the Commonwealth of Independent States and openly stated that that was the beginning of a new union. In other words, the plan to rebuild the union began the moment the Soviet Union fell apart. Putin intended to revive that plan." He went on to explain that any such plan would have to start not with Central Asian nations like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, but the Slavic nations like Belarus and Ukraine, where so much of traditional Russian culture came from. As the geopolitical analyst notes, after securing control over Belarus, Ukraine was next, and not just the 21% of Ukrainian territory currently under dispute. The plan was to take all of Ukraine. If Russia succeeded, it would claim legitimacy to reclaim the rest of the former empire. Perhaps not the Baltic states, but certainly the Caucasus and Central Asia. Graziano went on to state that Russia has not only failed in Ukraine, but has suffered much greater losses than Putin might ever have imagined, with former allies turning their back on the Kremlin as the country's war machine continues to toil on the front lines. Instead, Russia has shot itself in the foot. This war has cost it the influence it still had in the Caucasus and has pushed Central Asian states away. Russia is fighting a war it's visibly incapable of winning, The Battle of Stalingrad lasted 6.5 months. The battle for Pokros has dragged on for 18 months and is still unresolved. The fact that Russia captured only 1% more of Ukraine in all of 2025 should settle the debate. Russia is not winning this war. These aren't opinions, but facts, grounded in reality and backed by real data. There's no doubt at all that the war has not gone to plan for Putin by any stretch of the imagination. Back when it all began, he and many other high-ranking Russian officials reportedly believed that the invasion would be over and done with within a matter of days. FSB agents were already lining up the next pro-Russian regime that was set to take over control of Kyiv once current President Volodymyr Zelensky was removed from power and Moscow soldiers were ready to don their parade uniforms and raise the Russian tricolour flag high and proud in the streets of Ukraine. It was supposed to be a crushing victory, a clear statement of Russian intent, a moment of rebirth and reconstruction for the entire former Soviet region, a moment that would do what Putin had wanted to do for so long and make Russia as feared and respected as it once had been. It was also supposed to define Putin's entire legacy, marking his place in the history books, ensuring he would be remembered with the same reverence and respect as the Russian Tsars of eras past, like Peter the Great, who Putin has likened himself to on several occasions. Well, the invasion will indeed most likely be what Putin is best remembered for, but his name won't go down in history associated with some grand victory or glorious Russian rebirth. Instead, he'll forever be known as the man who, through his own greed and hubris, broke Russia to bits. Because that's exactly what's happening. Both at home and beyond its borders, Russia is falling apart. Domestically, the country is facing some of the biggest and most challenging crises in its history, all of which are connected to the war. Firstly, there's the huge loss of life caused by the conflict itself, with a recent report from the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defence suggesting that Russia has suffered more than 1.1 million casualties since the war began. That means countless families far and wide across the country have been forced to bid farewell to fathers, sons, brothers and husbands. Others have, at least, been able to welcome their relatives home. But many will suffer severe physical and mental effects of the conflict for years to come, if not for the rest of their lives. This in turn can only have a negative impact on Putin's popularity, as even the most hardened Russian nationalists begin to wonder how and why a war that was supposed to be over in a few days has dragged on for so long and led to such devastating losses. Then there are the economic impacts. Prior to the invasion, Russia's economy wasn't the best in the world, but it was largely steady and stable, forged on the strong foundations of the country's impressive energy and oil industries. The country also had a healthy national wealth fund, with large reserves of both rubles and various international currencies, combined with strong trade links across Europe, Asia and beyond. In the years since the Kremlin's forces entered Ukraine, Russia's economy has continued to grow, but only slowly and unevenly. After initial disruption, GDP expanded by roughly 3.6% in 2023 and 3.8% in 2024, according to IMF estimates, with growth expected to slow sharply in 2025 and 2026. Western sanctions have crippled the country's banks and businesses, cutting their connections with many markets and international trade partners. The value of the ruble has nosedived, the wealth fund has been depleted, and many of the country's once strong industries have been reduced to a fraction of their former size, cannibalized by the all-consuming military defense complex, which is now the only thing keeping the country from plunging into a historic recession. Everyone in Russia is feeling the heat, from the elites and oligarchs who've had their assets frozen and wealth levels slashed to simple Russian families, who are struggling more than ever to afford the most basic everyday essentials like food, housing and fuel. And speaking of fuel, that too was once an integral element of Russia's strength and standing, with dozens of countries relying on its vast oil reserves to meet their energy needs. Now, Russian exporters are running out of countries to sell to. As sanctions become stricter, average barrel prices decline, and an increasing number of nations back away from buying Moscow's resources, seeking alternative options elsewhere. Ukraine has also played its part in this crisis. cleverly striking at fuel-related infrastructure across occupied territories and Russian regions, crippling the country's production capacities and hitting the Kremlin where it hurts most, their bank accounts. These many factors have all led to increasing unrest and even murmurs of separatism and rebellion in regions all over Russia, from those closest to Ukraine to those in the Far East, thousands of miles from Moscow and Kyiv. Protests have erupted in the Altai region, for example, where people are increasingly sick and tired of being dictated to by authoritarian oligarchs. In the Sakha Republic too, which covers some 3 million square kilometers of Siberia, separatist sentiments are spreading, with even local elected officials speaking out against the Kremlin. Meanwhile, in Ingushetia, in the North Caucasus, partisan forces like the Ingush Liberation Army are regularly carrying out actual organized attacks on Russian agents, like FSB officers and border guards. If Russia's economic issues, labor shortages and other crises continue, which is almost sure to happen so long as the war rages on, then these movements too will grow and spread even further. With that, the cracks that are already present across the Russian Federation would inevitably deepen, with the risk of rebellion, unrest or even civil war rising by the day. Beyond Russia's borders, it's a similar story. Many of the former Soviet republics that once looked to Russia as their guardian and provider are starting to question if the country is still up to the task. For years, they saw Russia as an all-powerful force, renowned for its military might and extraordinary power, with its leader, Vladimir Putin, seemingly capable of getting whatever he wanted whenever he desired. Then they watched as Russia invaded Ukraine, and Putin failed to get what he wanted again and again. They saw how the supposedly invincible Russian war machine floundered and failed on the front lines of Donetsk, how so-called world-leading Russian tanks and other hardware were blown apart, how even after years of fighting, the Kremlin's army still struggles to achieve even the most minor of objectives or capture the tiniest slivers of territory. Bit by bit, the myth of Russia's superiority and strength, a myth that Putin himself has spent so many years carefully constructing to project power and intimidate former Soviet nations, began to shatter. Countries started to see through the lies. They realized that Russia wasn't in fact as powerful as it had claimed. After all, it couldn't even win a war or gain ground against a far smaller and weaker opponent. As that happened, many of those same countries started to reassess their relationships with Russia. We've seen the likes of Armenia and Azerbaijan slowly drift away from the Kremlin's control, for example, with the latter in particular taking active steps toward building better bonds with other countries in order to reduce its reliance on Russia. Across Central Asia too, many of the former Soviet states that have clung to Russia since the early 1990s have started to rewrite their foreign policies. Places like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are, for example, exploring new trade routes and international connections, realizing at last that there are other ways for them to function and survive, and that they don't necessarily need to be so dependent on Russia moving forward. Then there are the aforementioned nations like Georgia and Moldova, who now appear more focused than ever before on looking to the West, not the East, for future support, security and trade. And all of this adds up to a very grim reality for President Putin. In attacking Ukraine, he hoped to lay the groundwork for a new Russian empire. He thought that through intimidation and power projection, he would bring these countries back into the fold. What he's actually done is push them away. And not only that, but he's also pushing his own people away, leaving populations and communities across many Russian regions feeling marginalized, ignored, isolated, and mistreated. It wasn't so long ago that Putin seemed like the most powerful man on earth. Now, he's never looked weaker. Check out this video for a deeper look at the problems facing Russia today as a result of Putin's insatiable lust for power. Or for a glimpse at what might be his last desperate roll of the dice, check out this video, which looks at what the Russian president might have planned for the NATO alliance in 2026. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel too, if you haven't already, so you don't miss out on the latest breaking news from the Russia-Ukraine war or other big conflicts across the globe.